All right, good morning everybody and welcome to our 4D webinar series. Today's webinar is about using Subversion, or SVN, sometimes referred to, with 4D. My name is Michel Guerin and I'll be your host for today's webinar. On the agenda today, we will start with an introduction about Subversion. So why Subversion? Well, analysts such as Forrester Research recognize Subversion as the sole leader in standalone software configuration management. And as a developer, keeping control of your current and historical source code, web pages, and documentation is critical. So in this webinar, we will show you how SVN will help you manage your code versioning within your 4D development environment. Then we'll wrap up the session with some pointers to additional references, and we'll end it up with a Q&A session. So note to all the attendees, to enter your question, you will have to type them in the chat window, the same as the picture you see here on the right, and that chat window is provided by WebEx. Feel free to add comments, your questions during the presentation. We will, however, answer them at the end of the presentation and not during. All right, our speaker today is Josh Fletcher from our account management engineering team. Josh has lots of experience messing up his and other people's code, so we forced him to use SVN. Since then, he has become the biggest fan of Subversion at 4D. So without further ado, let me wake up our speaker of the day, Josh Fletcher. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Michel. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to the webinar today. It's early in the morning, so I've just woken up. I've had my coffee, though, so we should be ready to go.
Excellent.
So, as Michel said, today we're going to talk about Subversion. We're going to talk about 4D. Specifically, I'm going to be talking mostly in a 4D v13 context. The main reason for that is kind of a fundamental piece of getting 4D going with Subversion is the source toolkit feature. So later on in the session, we'll take a look at how we can use source toolkit to get 4D going with Subversion or better. But so I called this session a practical guide to using Subversion with 4D, intentionally choosing the word practical. I did that because source control or revision control is really a huge, huge area of software development. In fact, in larger companies and larger organizations where you have really big teams, an integration engineer can actually be a position or even multiple positions. So I didn't want to spend our entire webinar talking about all the different flavors of version control and all the different concepts behind revision control and all that kind of thing. I wanted to keep it more practical. Another reason for that is I think in the 4D community there is not a terribly high usage of revision control software. So I think a lot of 4D developers might be unfamiliar with something like Subversion. So again, my goal in this webinar is to, even if you've never touched revision control software, to give you enough to get going with it and use it, because the fact is it can benefit everyone. I'm not even talking about just team development or large teams of developers. Even a solo developer can benefit from revision control software. So hopefully by the end of the webinar you will agree with me and want to take a look at it. It is going to be somewhat of a beginner session. So if you're familiar with Subversion already, this may not be all that interesting, but nonetheless there might be some information here that's useful to you. So although it is going to be, for the most part, practical, I am going to digress a little bit here at the beginning and go over some of the theory so that we're kind of all on the same page when we talk about revision control. So what is revision control? So in any software project, as you work on it, it goes through revisions. You make changes, of course, but that's not what I mean. For example, if you release a version to a customer, that's that's a revision. That's a type, almost like a milestone revision, and then you're going to continue doing development, but you still have that version out there in the field. So what ends up happening most of the time in software is you have to have multiple different copies of whatever it is you're working on. The copy that's deployed to your customer, the copy that's currently in development. Maybe you have multiple versions of your software, as we do at 4D. We have 4D v13, we have 4D v12. So revisions are a natural part of software development. The difficulty comes when you need to keep track of which revisions are which. So the idea with revision control software, first of all, of course, is control. It's in the name, that's kind of obvious. But more to the point, revision control provides a structured way of maintaining and tracking different versions of the software. And so the most common way that's achieved with various pieces of revision control software is basically to assign a number to a revision. So you might have a versioning scheme that you're using in your applications, and that's fine. You can keep that. But behind the scenes, your revision control software is going to keep track of each revision with a number as well, and that makes it easy to keep track of which version is which. One of the things this allows you to do, I'm calling time travel, which may seem kind of silly, but really what revision control allows you to do is move back and forth through development time. So let me show you an example of what I mean. This is a commit log for one of the projects that I work on, which is actually the source code of our 4D store, which is actually used for a couple of other tools as well. In other words, we have multiple applications running off the same 4D source code. So you can see there's revision numbers there in the column on the left. There's the user who made that change is listed. The date and time of the change is listed, and then there's some messages, you know, that we use to keep track of things internally. The thing that I want to show you here is the version of the software that we have deployed here in the US. So we use this for an internal tool to keep track of orders and customer information and so on and so forth. The version we have deployed is 2.21. As you can see, there's been many, many revisions since then. There's an engineer that I work with in France, Mikhail, who's, you know, he's always working on the store code. I don't have his changes deployed yet. What happened was I found a bug in revision 2.21, and it was significant enough that I needed to fix it. Well, the great thing about revision control software is I can do that easily. I can go back in time, I can get that version that I wanted, which was 4D Store 1.4.744. And I used a feature called branching, which basically just means give me a copy. So this second little screenshot you see here is on the server side of things. You can see we've had a few different versions of the store, a few different branches of the store. I just made a branch of revision 2.21, checked it out, fixed the bug, built it, and deployed it. And then the bug was fixed and our users could go on, and I didn't have to worry about all the extra changes that had been made and whether that code worked and was functioning or anything like that. Of course, I needed to make the bug fix in the main branch as well. But the point here is that Subversion gave me a structured environment to easily go back in time, find the version that I need to make the fix in. I didn't have to worry about having copies on my computer and where did I put the copy and all that kind of thing. It's really easy to do. So that's an example of the power of revision control software. The absolute most important key thing, though, about using revision control software is that it automates all of this. Keeping track of the different versions, keeping track of the date and time that it was made, and so on and so forth. You can do all that yourself. You can make copies of the database and store them on your computer and try to keep track of which one is which. But an easy example of understanding why that's difficult with 4D, every time you open a 4D database, the structure file and the data file and resource files, if you have them, get updated. Even if you didn't make changes, they will be the date and the time, the date modified and the time modified from the OS's perspective will change every time you launch the database. So if you've got more than one copy of the database, it's impossible to tell which one is the latest one based on date and time, for example. So revision control software comes in and gives you the power to automate that, and you don't have to worry about it. So moving on, looking at this theory a little bit more, I want to talk about some terminology that's commonly used in a revision control context. A couple of points to make. One, I'm only going to talk about things that I think make sense for 4D. Again, revision control is a huge area of software development, so we're not going to cover all that here in the next couple of minutes. The second point is the terms that I'm going to be used are specific to Subversion. The concept of revision control software, but the actual terms I'll pick, I'll be Subversion specific, and that's just to make it easier for us to get through the session today. So first of all, revision control or Subversion has this concept of a repository and a working copy, and it's basically a client-server design. The repository is the master copy of all the software. You can consider that the server side of things. The most important thing about the repository is you don't work on the files that are stored in the repository directly, and that's where the control comes in. What happens is you make a copy of those files, and it's called the working copy, and you put that on your machine that you're working on the project in. So the working copy is the client side of things. Now, there are other revision control solutions that are not client-server based, distributed ones like Git. I'm not going to go into details about those kinds. I just want to point out that they do exist. For 4D, I think a client-server model like this works well, and especially for smaller teams or solo developers even, it keeps it relatively simple. Now, so in order to work in a revision control context, you need to be able to do a couple of things. So check out is the term that refers to getting the assets out of the repository and onto the local machine. In other words, creating a working copy, you do a checkout. If somebody makes changes to the project and commits those back to the repository and you need to get those changes, that's referred to as update. In other words, give me the latest changes from the server. That's called update. The important thing about update is it only gives you what's changed. So one of the powers of revision control software is it's very efficient in terms of keeping track of only the things that are changed, and then so you only have to download the things that are changed. So it's very efficient that way. And of course, when you make changes and you need to get those back into the repository, that's referred to as commit. So when you're done and you're ready to check in a revision, you commit the changes, and that's how you do it. So that kind of, if you look at this, it kind of looks like a database, and it really is. You've got the ability to create, to read, to update, and to delete. So creating methods, deleting methods, and updating them, changing them is all handled by the commit phase, and the checkout and the update is kind of your read, if you think about it in a database context. A few more terms to go over here. Now, revision control often implies team development, and which of course implies that perhaps more than one person might attempt to change the same asset. So you have conflicts. So you need some kind of conflict resolution. So in any revision control software, conflict resolution is often a big topic. It's not the easiest thing to do in 4D, and we'll look at we'll talk more in depth about that later. But the idea is, okay, two people modified it. How can I resolve that? If it's just a text file, well, I can pull the two different copies up, and I can see what was changed and decide which ones to keep and things like that. So there's different ways to handle conflict resolution. You're going to hear diff a lot. I'm going to use that today, which basically means difference. And the idea is let's take two revisions of an asset, a file, and compare them together and see what's changed. So that's really one of the key tasks that you will attack in a revision control situation. A few other things. Revert. So the idea with revert is if I've got some stuff in my working copy and I make some changes, but I decide I don't want to keep those changes, I want to revert back to the last known good copy that I had from the repository. That's what's referred to as revert in Subversion. Revert's going to be your friend when you work with 4D for the reason that I already mentioned. Every time you launch a database, 4D updates the date time modified. So it can be somewhat difficult to keep track of whether or not you made changes. So a habit that you're going to want to get into with 4D is to revert. If you open the database and don't make any changes and quit, you want to immediately revert. So we'll look at an example of that later. A couple more. Branching, I already showed you an example of that. Branching basically means make a copy of what's in the repository so that I can work on that in parallel with the original main source code. Perfect example of branching is for 4D, we have V13, we have V12. Those are two different branches of basically the same source code with different feature sets and things like that, of course, but we maintain those two things. Naturally, we need the ability to merge changes between branches. In other words, if I fix a bug in one branch, it's likely I need to fix a bug in another branch. And so there's a task that's referred to as merging when you're doing revision control. And I think so that's all I'm going to cover today. Again, just a reminder, revision control is a very large topic. I've given you the basics that you need for working with 4D, I think. It gets you off the ground and gets you able to do a lot of really cool things. And so we're going to stop with the theory there and kind of move on to the practical stuff, which Michelle, I'm sure, is thankful for.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So first I want to talk about subversion. If you're not familiar with it, this will be your introduction. So Subversion is a revision control software solution. When we announced that we were going to do a webinar on Subversion, somebody on Twitter commented something along the lines of 2001 called and we want our version control back. Subversion is an older software solution, but the fact is it's not a dead software solution. So even though it's old, it's very well established. It's still being updated today. I think the last version of the client that I downloaded was released a couple of weeks ago. I mean, Subversion is by no means a dead technology. So it's very well established. It's very well maintained. The benefits for us as 4D developers of having a well-established piece of software is that there's a wealth of knowledge and information out there on the internet when you run into problems and things like that. To put that into perspective, one of the employees here at 4D said, well, why don't you use Git? If you're not familiar with Git, it's a GIT. Git's a very popular distributed revision control solution out there right now. There's a website called GitHub, which is a very popular repository. Now, first of all, GitHub, if you post code on GitHub, it's open to the public. I'm sure a lot of 4D developers wouldn't be comfortable with that. So for one thing, we want something that's private. And so this person said, well, why don't you just run a Git server? I said, okay, fine. I went and I Googled and I searched to see Git server on Windows. How do I get Git server running on Windows? The first result was a Stack Exchange page. In other words, a Q&A website. It wasn't product documentation. And it was like a 20-step process using the terminal to get a Git server running on Windows. So one of the advantages of using a well-established revision control product like Subversion is it's easy. And that's one of the things that I always like to give to 4D developers is I don't want to make you learn a whole new thing just so you can use, revision control. So what I mean by easy is, for example, the server software packages for Subversion come in regular old installers. On Windows, you double-click it, you run it, you install it, and you're good to go. You don't have to worry about using the terminal and configuring all this stuff. So that's those are some of the reasons why I picked Subversion. Another thing about Subversion is it's open source. The benefit for you is that a lot of the client and server packages for Subversion are free. The one that we are using, I'm going to skip ahead here since I already said it. Sorry, it comes later. My bad. Sorry. So it's open source. The server packages are often free. The server that we're using, which I'll talk about here in a second, is a free one. Another reason why I picked Subversion is in the context of the way it handles multiple people working on the same files. Subversion is optimistic. So let me put that in perspective by giving a contrary example. There's another source control solution called Perforce. Perforce is pessimistic. In Perforce, when you check out and make a working copy, the files are all read-only. If you want to modify a file that's under the control of Perforce, you have to actually issue a command and say, hey, Perforce, I want to modify this file. Perforce goes off and it checks to see if anybody else has that file checked out and if they're trying to modify it, and it warns you and so on and so forth. So it's very pessimistic that way. SVN or Subversion is optimistic. If you want to modify a file in your working copy in Subversion, you just open it up and modify it. So it's very easy to use in a 4D context where when you're working inside 4D, you don't really have to worry about Subversion at all. You open up 4D, you make your changes, you quit 4D, and then you go to commit your changes, and that's where Subversion comes into play. So again, it's easy to use in that respect. The last one of the final reasons why I chose Subversion, and I'm going to turn into a little bit of a fanboy here, is the Windows client that's available called Tortoise SVN. Tortoise SVN is really pretty much the best thing since we hired Michelle.
Thank you for that.
No, it really is. It's a really great client for Subversion. The main reason why I think it's so neat is that it integrates directly with Windows Explorer. The point being, if you know how to use Windows Explorer, you already know how to use Tortoise SVN. For example, if you want to check out, you right-click on a folder and you do SVN checkout. If you want to commit some changes, you right-click on the folder and you select commit. So the point is, it's all driven through something that you already use. On the Mac side of things, it's not quite as peachy of a situation. I think probably if you're like me, you hate using the Finder in the first place. There are some Subversion clients on the Mac that integrate with the Finder, but they're much more limited in the functionality that they offer. So on the Mac side, you're going to end up usually getting a separate piece of client software, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So in order to use Subversion, you need some software. First of all, you need a server. Now, what do you do with the Subversion server? The good news is not much. The only thing that I've ever had to do with our Subversion server is basically manage permissions, in other words, who has access to which projects, and create repositories. That's it. Those are the only 2 times I ever have to walk over to the Subversion server and interact with it. The one that we're using here at 4D is called Visual SVN Server. As I said before, they offer a free for commercial use version of Visual SVN Server. They have a professional version as well that offers extra features. I haven't found the need for them for our projects, and I think in a 4D context, the needs are fairly simple. So that's just an example of a SVN server that's available. You don't have to use that one. I'm just putting it here because that's the one that we use. Of course, you need client software. What do you do with the client software? Everything else. Checking out, committing changes, getting updates, branching, merging, diffing, conflict resolution, all of that stuff happens on the client side. So the client's really kind of the bread and butter. As I said already, on Windows, I recommend using Tortoise SVN. It's really not worth it to look at anything else, in my opinion. Tortoise SVN is kind of the de facto standard there. On the Mac side of things, there's a few more options. There are some free options, but I haven't found a free one that really I like much. So the 2 popular, although paid options, are Cornerstone and Versions. I'm personally using Cornerstone. Really, the only reason I'm using Cornerstone is because my counterpart that I work with in France uses Cornerstone. He primarily develops on Mac, and so I think it's helpful for us to be using the same environment in case we run into problems and things like that. But, I mean, use whichever one makes sense to you, whichever one you like. The thing about Subversion is it's a standard, so all the clients support the same features for the most part. It's just the way the information is presented and how easy they are to use. How do you set up Subversion? It's pretty simple. Install the server, create some repositories. Now, something I want to point out here, creating a repository, it may sound like something fancy. Basically, it's creating a folder. That's really all it is. And I'll show you an example here in a minute. Set permissions if necessary. So with Visual SVN Server, another reason I like it is it integrates with your Windows domain logins. So setting permissions really just means choosing some Windows users to decide who has access to what. I don't have to create users. I don't have to set passwords. I don't have to do any of that kind of stuff. Install your client software. Check out. You're good to go. Now, going back to creating a repository and checking out. What do I get when I check out? So here's an example. I created a repository on our Subversion server called Dave. It was for one of the employees here. And this is a screenshot on the client side after having checked out and creating a working copy of Dave. And as you can see, Dave hasn't actually started using his repository. Sorry, Dave. So it's empty. But empty except for one thing. There is a folder called .svn. That's going to appear at the root of any working copy. So let me give you a little more fleshed out example here. This is a screenshot of our webinars a working copy based on our webinars repository. So you can see there's a few other projects in here. One of the things that Tortoise SVN does for you is it gives you these icon overlays. So the little check marks mean that there are no changes in that particular folder, and the red exclamation means there are some changes in that folder. So I've been working on this practical SVN webinar, and so of course there are some changes pending. So again, the .svn folder is really the key. That's what allows your Subversion client to understand and to know what's going on with that project, to know which files are changed, to know what the last good version was, to know where the server is. All that stuff is tracked inside that folder. Now there's something that I want to point out for you guys about different versions. There's two different versions of Subversion. Relatively recently, they released Subversion 1.7. So it's possible that you might run into 1.6. That's why I'm pointing this out, because it's relatively recent. Under Subversion 1.6, every single folder in the working copy has a .svn folder. Another way to say that is every folder in the working copy is itself a working copy. In Subversion 1.7, they consolidated it all into one single .svn folder at the root of the working copy. Now, why did they do that? So to give you an idea, the 1.6 model is very convenient because, for example, here we are looking at a working copy of all the webinars. The fact is I'm only working on one of the webinars, so maybe I don't want to have all of these checked out on my machine. Well, under 1.6, all I have to do is delete the folders that I've now highlighted in red, including that .svn folder, and the practical SVN folder then becomes my only working copy. So having that SVN folder embedded inside each folder makes it easy to do stuff like that. But on the flip side, if I wanted to send somebody a copy of the practical SVN project and I grabbed this folder and I copied it and I sent it to them, under 1.6 they'd also get my .svn folder, which has things like my username and password. It's of course hashed, but still, has a repository location. It has a whole bunch of junk that that person doesn't care about. So under the 1.7 model, it's kind of nice because it's easy to copy the folders that are contained inside the working copy and send them around. So it's just a trade-off. Also, just something for you to be aware of because it was a relatively recent change. All right. So that covers the basics of just the Subversion software, but now let's talk about what really matters, which is using Subversion with 4D. So I'm going to go through this kind of in stages of how can you get started using Subversion with 4D. What I consider stage one, the simplest case, is simply commit the database. Create a repository in your server, check it out, so you have your working copy, grab your database, drop it inside that folder, and commit it. What do you get by doing that? You actually do get some benefits there. For one thing, Subversion does differential copies. In other words, let's say you've got a 2 gigabyte database package, including the structured file and data file and so on and so forth. You commit that thing. So it's going to take up 2 gigabytes of space in the server. You make a change, you commit again. Is it going to take up 4 gigabytes in the server? Luckily, no, it's not. Subversion actually only keeps track of the differences between the different revisions. So it's very efficient in storage. So if you think about an example of where you've got multiple different versions deployed to customers and you've got to maintain all these different copies of the database, that starts taking up a lot of space. So Subversion is very efficient that way. Another thing you get that's kind of nice is a bit of an audit trail. Now, you're not going to be able to see the differences between, let's say, 240 structures in Subversion because those are large binary files. Pretty much every revision control software on the planet is really based around text files. So in that sense, you're not going to have an audit trail. But what you are going to have is, for example, I showed you that commit log earlier that had an area for comments. So every time you commit a revision, you can add comments to yourself in there, and that starts to build a little bit of an audit trail so you can see what's changed over time. Another thing about just doing this stage one first step is you're able to revert changes easily. If you open up the database and make a change you don't want to keep, quit the database, do an SVN revert, and you get back the original copy that you had. It's pretty much impossible to do with 4D. If you open a form, for example, and you make some changes and you close the form, those changes are committed. There's nothing you can do at that point. You get the ability to branch. I showed you an example of that already. So that's kind of the simplest case. It's not very compelling, I think, but it's something that you can do to get you started. But really, kind of the point of this webinar is what I'm calling stage 2. So with 40v13, we added a feature called Source Toolkit. The key thing about Source Toolkit is it allows you to export all of the methods in the database and get them into text files. As I said, revision control software is almost always really based around text files. So if we can get all the code out of the database and onto disk, now we're really getting somewhere. So what do we get? What are the benefits that we get if we, or how do we do that? So there's a Source Toolkit method called method get path. This returns a path to every method in the database. On top of that, and actually more important than that, method get path also gives you a stamp. In other words, if I call that and I pass in 0 as the stamp, I get every method in the database, but I also get the latest stamp. And then I can export all those methods to disk and so on and so forth. But I don't want to export every method to disk every time. That would be really inefficient. So the next time I call method get path, I pass in the last stamp value, and it gives me only what's been changed since the last time I called it. So that's really, really cool. Then, of course, there's a method called method get code, which allows you to get the code for each one of those paths, and then we can save that out to disk. So really what part of what this webinar is about is I built a component called code export, and that's going to be released as a tech note here at the end of the month. So it will be available to you guys. I'm going to show it to you today. So what are the benefits that we get by getting the code out of the database? Well, first of all, with the code export database, I put goals, it's not really plural. I really had one goal with this component. Going back to the fact that I think a lot of 40 developers aren't necessarily doing revision control, and also I don't want you to have to learn a whole new thing just to do this. Another way to say it is I want everybody using revision control. Even if you're a solo developer and you don't care about working as a team, I want everybody to try this. So my goal with the code export component was for it to have 0 impact on your existing development process, on your existing database. I don't want you to have to change any code in your database. I don't want you to have to worry about a bunch of configuration. There's no configuration, there's no impact on the database. And I'll show you that in the actual demonstration. So let's look at some of the benefits that we get from this stage 2 implementation. First of all, you get all the benefits from stage 1, which is checking the database in and having the comment log and so on and so forth. But really, one of the first things you get right off the bat is the ability to do a diff on methods. So the ability to see what changed in a method and compare the 2 different versions and so on and so forth. Since they're exported to text files, that's really easy to do. The ability to diff is built into pretty much any revision control or any Subversion client is going to have a diff viewer. Another set of benefits, and I'm just going to pop them all up here. If you rename a method with the Source Toolkit and that stamp feature I talked about, I will be able to get the path to the new method and export it to disk. If I do a global find and replace that touches a whole bunch of methods, again, I will be able to tell which ones were changed and export them to disk. So I can really keep those files on disk in sync with what's in the database. There's one that's a little bit tricky, which is if I delete a method, which is kind of similar to a rename. If I delete a method get path isn't going to give me anything because the method's gone. So that is one limitation of the code export implementation is it doesn't really handle deletions. But you might not care, and we'll get to that here in a second. Another great benefit to the Source Toolkit feature set is not only does it allow me to export the code, but it allows me to export the method attributes. So if I set a method to invisible, I'll be able to track that in Subversion and look at, here's the date that I set it to invisible and so on, that kind of thing. The last piece that's also fairly important is code export is kind of a component for the future. Because it's using the Source Toolkit feature, that's the feature we're going to be putting resources into. That's the feature set we're going to expand on. So this is kind of the foundation for the feature instead of relying on something that's older. Now, what are some risks to doing it this way, using the source toolkit to export the code? Well, of course, it doesn't keep track of changes to forms. It doesn't keep track of changes to lists, to users and groups, to the structure, any of that kind of stuff. So still, you know, we can't keep track of all those changes, but nonetheless, we can at least start with the methods, and it's still valuable just to have that as a foundation. But this is something to keep in mind. It's a bit sloppy, so as I mentioned, renaming or deleting. So if there was a method in the database that I exported to disk, and then I delete that method inside 4D, that file is still hanging out there on the disk. So it's a little bit sloppy. Same thing with deletes. Now again, you might not care about this. For us, internally, we don't. If I delete a method and I've got the file hanging out there on disk, who cares? The files on disk are an audit trail, but when I need to know what the latest version of a method is, I open the 4D database and I go look at the method. I'm not going to go look at what the files on disk are. So to some extent, for our work here in the office, these methods that are hanging around as text files really don't matter. If I'm going to go look at different versions of a method, I'm going to go open up a specific text file. So again, the presence of those orphan text files, it doesn't impact anything. It takes up a little extra space, but that's about it. So it is a limitation, but it's not that big of one. One risk with using Source Toolkit is a little bit of technical debt. In the past, 4D has allowed you to do some funky characters in your method names, like the asterisk and things like that. V13 doesn't allow you to do that anymore. So if you drop this component into an older database that has weird method names, you will get warnings about those method names and they will not be exported to disk. So that's just something to keep in mind. There is a log file so you can go back and find the methods that need to be fixed. And the last piece, I mentioned conflict resolution earlier. So if you're working in a revision control environment, say with C++, and you want to resolve a conflict between two different versions of a method, it's relatively easy to do that because they're just text files and you can look at the differences. With 4D, there's really no way to take two structure files and merge them together. So the conflict resolution in this implementation is still manual. If somebody checks in and somebody else checks in over the top, basically you need to get a copy of those two different structure files, launch them in 4D, and try to figure out what the difference was. Hopefully the user made good log entries to give you some clues of where to look. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Okay, so let's look at the actual component here. So what I have here on the disk, did that come up okay? You see the folder? Okay, yeah. Thanks, Joe. Is a database that we work on internally called 40IT Dashboard. It's a component that we drop into one of our tools for looking at customer information. I just want to show you that, so first of all, the components folder is empty right now. I'm going to launch the database, and just to show you that there's no startup code, and this gets back to the fact that I wanted the component to be no impact for you. So database methods on startup is blank, doesn't exist. So there's no startup code in this database. So I'm going to install the component, which is called, oops, sorry about that. Actually, let me just exit out of the slide view to make it easier. So the component's called code export. I'm going to copy that and put it into my components folder and then relaunch this database. Now, when the database first starts, nothing has happened. And the fact is, it's not that important because I haven't done anything yet. But as soon as I go and open a method, the component starts up and you can see the progress bar there. It's actually exporting all of the methods to disk. So in other words, I'm using a macro event to kick off the component code. So again, the point is, you don't have to modify your database. That all automatically runs. Now there's a background process running and keeping track of the methods, or the changes to the methods. And I'll show you what happened on disk. So here's the database with the component installed, and there's two new folders. CE stands for code export. CE_data, that's not really important for you. That's just some metadata that the component uses to keep track of stuff internally. But CE_source is the interesting one. So I open that up, and there's all of the database methods exported to disk. You can see I exported them at 942. I'm going to, yeah, we're sorting by date modified, so that's good. That's what I want. So I'll show you, if I modify a method, I'll put it something more obvious. WebR. And I'm trying to wait for my clock to kick over. Okay, so my clock just kicked over to 9:43. I'm going to go ahead and save and go back to Windows Explorer, and you can see that __scratch.txt has a time modified now of 9:43. So in the background, the component automatically exported that change. I'll show you one more example here. This is actually, I think, the cooler one. I'm going to do a find in database for a particular interprocess variable. You can see that that variable is used in several different methods. I'm going to do a replace in content and rename this variable. Just give it a silly name. So 40 goes off and it makes a bunch of changes to a bunch of different methods. If we go back to, it's still 943. Anyway, if we go back to the file system, you can see that all of those methods have been updated and exported to disk. So now we're really getting somewhere. Now, I haven't mentioned anything about Subversion yet. This particular example I'm showing you, I'm not doing anything with Subversion. So just to point out, the code export component can be used without Subversion. You'll just have one copy of the methods. You don't get any kind of an audit trail, but it is just kind of a place to start. So let me go ahead and quit this database and show you something now that's actually in a Subversion context. In fact, I'm going to use the source code of the code export database. So here's my working copy for the code export tech note that I've been working on, and here's the code export database source code. So what can we do with Subversion? So again, I'm on Windows. I'm using Tortoise SVN. I'm going to right-click on this folder. I can do SVN update, which would give me the latest changes from the server. There actually aren't any changes. I haven't made any recent changes. I can right-click and do show log, which shows me all of the different changes that I've made throughout the life of this project. So here's at the top, here's all my different check-ins. In the middle is a comment section, which is just comments to myself, basically, for the different changes that I'm checking in. There's the revision numbers in the column on the left, the date and the time. But really, the coolest thing is there's a list down here of every method that was modified as part of that commit, whether I modified it, whether I added it, whether I deleted it, so on and so forth. And even better, here's a method that I modified called CE_log_process. I can double click it. I want to know what I changed, so I double click it. Tortoise SVN has its own diff viewer built in. It grabs the old version, it grabs the current version, it highlights the differences. In the old version, I was showing an error message. In the new version, I'm calling a method called CE_log show warning. I mean, as simple as that. It has synchronized scrolling. So as I scroll through the method, it keeps the left and the right side aligned so I can see, you know, in context where the differences are. So again, this is kind of just giving you an idea of the things that you can do with Subversion. And the fact is, it's just built in. I double clicked on a file and that's it. I can see the differences. Let's see. Okay. What else? Yeah, that's it. Okay. All right. So enough of the Subversion logs. Let's open up the actual database. Actually, yeah, we don't really need to open the database. Sorry, we already looked at an example. Well, you know what? I will. Just to show you, I'll do the same test that I did a minute ago, which is to rename something that affects, you know, a few different methods. So project methods, and I'll rename this, maybe this guy, search callers. Yeah, it only shows up in 2 places, but that's all right. So I'm going to rename this CE_pref get. Oops, sorry. Rename method, and I'll call it pref get, whatever, ZZZ. So 40 goes off and renames the method. If we go back to here, and now the little shell overlays start to show the changes. So I open the database, which means the 4DB file has been flagged as changed. The CE source folder has some changes, so I'll open that up and I'll sort by date time. And you can see that a new method has been exported because I renamed that prefget to prefget ZZZ, and it appears in compiler methods, so that got updated, and this other CE-mon process method got updated as well. So just to show you, one of the really neat things about doing something like code export with Subversion is now I can see, as I'm working in real time, what methods have I changed. I don't have to keep, like, I know some developers, what they do is they keep the method windows open as they're working and they don't close them until they're done making changes. You don't have to do that anymore. If I want to know what I changed, I go out to disk and I look. Here's the methods that I changed. So again, that's a really neat thing about using revision control software, using Subversion. Okay, a couple of other just practical scenarios. Well, one more practical scenario to talk about. I mentioned earlier about conflicts. So let's say someone else comes along and is working on my code export project, and they check in and they commit over the top of some changes that I made. If you do that, and this has actually happened to me with our store code, once somebody commits over the top of the 4D database, any changes that you made are gone. They overwrote it. There's no way to diff the database. No, sorry, I said that wrong. There's no easy way to diff the database and figure out what the changes were. You can't merge it. You can't diff the structure file. But what you can do is you can diff the exported source code. So if I changed a method and I committed that change, and then somebody else came along and changed the same method, well, now I can go in with my Subversion client and do the diff and see what was changed and decide which one to keep. And furthermore, I can check out their copy of the structure that they committed over the top of mine. I can open the method up. I can take the text version, copy and paste it, and save that into the database. So it gives you a fallback way to prevent your changes from being overwritten. So another example of something that you can do with Subversion. Okay. Now, back to our slides here. A few more things to talk about. Looking beyond the code export component, what other things can we do? Well, I already have an idea in mind to keep track of renames and deletes. As I said before, right now it's a little bit sloppy because it leaves those orphaned files behind, which I don't necessarily care about. But if we did want to look towards keeping track of renames and deletes, it would just be a matter of keeping track of the result of that method getPaths command. In other words, call method getPaths, I get a list of all the paths in the database. I need to save that somewhere. Then the next time I call method getPaths, I can compare the current version versus the previous version, and if anything's missing, well, that's probably a deleted method or a rename method, and so I can go off and delete the text file, for example. Another thing that I haven't really talked about too much is team development. So what do I need to do to get going with team development and Subversion and 4D? Okay, this thankfully is really easy. First of all, the code export component, if installed in server, runs on server. So all the source code is going to be exported on the server side. So that's one good thing. The second thing is, the fact is 4D already has a team development solution. So let's not fight what's already there. If you want to do multiple people working on the same database with 4D, you use 4D Team Developer. In other words, you launch the database in 4D server, the users connect, and they make changes. 4D already handles locking the methods, for example, so more than one person can't change the same method. So this is what we do in the office. If more than one person needs to work on the same project, we launch it in server, and we go off and we work. So that's an easy way to tackle team development and still keep using something like code export with Subversion. All right, so finally, I'm going to end the thing with some practical tips for using 4D with Subversion. Revert is going to be your friend. So let's go back to the file system here, and I've made some changes to this code export component that I don't want to keep. So let me quit 4D. I'm going to right-click on the working copy folder. I'm going to do Tortoise SVN revert. I'm going to select all the files that I don't want to keep and hit OK. and roll the changes back. The shell overlays sometimes take a little while to refresh. There, it finally refreshed. So now I'm back to where I was before we started the webinar, and I don't have to keep those changes. So that's going to be something you probably commonly do with 4D, mainly because of what I mentioned before. Every time you open the database, the date and the time get modified, so it looks like it's changed even if it's not. If somebody ever asks you for the latest version of a project you're working on, that's really easy to do with Subversion. The latest revision is referred to as the head revision. So you just right-click on your working copy, you do update, and there's the latest version. You don't have to keep track of different copies of the database, so that's really easy. One of the things I recommend if you use 4D with Subversion is keeping the data file in a separate folder. If you have a large data file in particular, every time you open the database, the data file is going to be marked as changed. If you go to commit, you're going to have to send that entire data file over the wire to the server, so that becomes kind of tedious. So if you move the data file to a separate folder, then you can only commit that when you actually want to commit it, so it makes the work more efficient. And so that's something that we've done with most of our systems here. Remember that Subversion has differential storage, so it's going to be really efficient in how it stores the files. I have a few more tips here, but I'm actually going to exit out of the slides for those and show them on the disk instead. Subversion supports something called an ignore list. So there's a few things that I recommend ignoring. For one, I recommend ignoring your logs folder because that's machine specific to your machine. Your preferences folders are often machine specific, so that has the backup preferences and the build app preferences. You can see that I have a 4D link file and a batch file that I use to launch this database. There's no reason for me to check those in to the repository because, again, those are machine-specific. 4D link files especially, the paths in a 4D link file are not relative, so they only make sense on my machine. So I put those in the ignore list. So just keep that ignore list in mind. Don't commit things that don't make sense, that don't need to be in the repository. One thing that I'm unfortunately just going to have to kind of gloss over, but Subversion is really convenient for build automation, so I'm just going to show you a little build framework that I have for one of our internal tools. It's a series of batch files. The batch files aren't really that exciting. I'm just going to show you this specific one called export revs. So what I do as part of the build is I get the latest version of the software from the repository using the SVN export command. In other words, my build environment doesn't actually have the source code in it. I get the source code on the fly when I need it, and I always have the latest version. So that's another thing that Subversion is really cool for, is any kind of build automation like this, scripted build automation. The last one that I want to show you, which is really pretty cool, I think, going back to this database, the code export database, there is a feature built into this database to reset and re-export all of the methods. So you can see the date time on my machine is 9:55 a.m. I'm going to re-export everything. So I got to open up, and it's driven through macros. Again, no impact on your host database. I'll do code export full reset, which basically causes it to go off and re-export all the methods to disk. So if we go look at the disk and look at the source folder, you can see that the date time is 9:56. But make note of the fact that every single method still has the green check mark. I didn't actually change the methods. All I did is re-export them. Subversion is smart enough to know whether or not that file actually really changed. It's not looking at the date and the time. What it's really looking at is the content. And it does a hashing to keep track of it. But anyway, that's just, the details aren't that exciting. So that's another thing that I think is really cool, because in 4D, if you open a method and close a method, you may not know if you changed it or not. Again, you can go out to the disk and you can see, did I change it? So one last little thing for the obsessive compulsives out there. Some of you may have been looking at the folders here and noticed that there's a typo in the practical SVN folder. I did that on purpose. So this is the root of a working copy, and I just wanted to show you that the working copies are really self-contained. I can rename that folder, and it's in use, sorry, because I have the slides open, so it's not actually going to work, my bad. But I could, if I didn't have it open, rename that folder, and it will continue to work just fine. More to the point, I can drag this folder and put it someplace else on my hard drive. My working copy is still going to work just fine. It's all relative, so that's really neat. It really makes it really easy to use. Okay. So that's it for me. Hopefully, what I'm hoping, especially if you've never used Subversion or never done revision control, my goal with this webinar is for you to see that it's relatively easy to use, and I want everybody to go out and try it. So keep an eye out for the SVN for Beginners Tech Note. That's going to have the code export component. I put some links here to all the software that I mentioned, and I'll hand it back over to Michel.
All right, thank you, Josh, for this nice introduction to using SVN with 4D. There's on this slide some references because we're running out of time, and I want people to have a chance to ask questions and for us to give some answers. So I'll actually go over those references really fast. I won't go over the ones that are on the slide, but I want to add that, for instance, we still have our call for papers open for the summit. So if you guys have some great...
Please submit. Please
we extended that deadline because we'd like to see a lot more interesting. I'm sure you guys are working on a great project and doing some cool stuff with 4D, and we'd love to know about it. So send us a quick email on that, or apply actually at 4d.com/summit. The other thing, if you have ideas in terms of webinars you'd like to see, make sure to drop us an email, a note at marketing@4d.com, and we'll work on those. And that's it for the references. Let's go over the questions. Our team member, Bill, went over those questions. Which ones we have?
Okay, there's not too many, so I should be able to get all of them, actually. Someone asked, are there source control softwares that are compatible with 4D? And I'm assuming what they mean is there source control that can take two 4D structure files and do a diff on them, for example? I haven't found one. I don't think there is. Pretty much every revision control software I've seen is based around text files as far as the built-in diff is concerned. But, for example, Subversion can do a diff with two Word documents. What it really does is it opens up the current one and the previous one and actually launches Word, because Word has a built-in diff. So unfortunately, there's really nothing that integrates directly with 4D. In fact, that was really one of the reasons why we did the Source Toolkit feature, is rather than try to build something into 4D and therefore choose a version control software, we built something that allows you to get your code out and then use whatever revision control software you want. So somebody asked, is the TechNote going to be available to all or only for partners? The TechNote will definitely only be available for partners initially. We're looking at some options to maybe make the code export component available without the TechNote, so just the component itself. So keep an eye out. We'll probably have something like that in the future. Somebody asked, are you able to exclude files from Subversion? We already looked at that. You can do that. Are you planning on exporting forms? So I can't really comment on the future features of 4D, unfortunately. Certainly, the ability to export forms, we know there's a demand for it. What I would say to you guys, the most important thing is for you to use the Source Toolkit feature and file feature requests. So code export will be a great way for you to get started using the Source Toolkit feature. But really what I'm getting at is engineering needs to see demand for the feature. So if there's demand for the feature, then they can prioritize looking at things like exporting forms. The build automation, somebody said that they like the build automation, and can you see it in more detail? You can, actually. I did a tech note on build automation that talks about what you saw there as far as using batch files to control build steps and so on and so forth. So go to kb.4d.com, search for build automation, and you should be able to find that tech note. And that was all the questions.
All right. So this last question wraps up today's webinar. Thank you all for attending, and I hope we'll see you at our next webinar. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.